Good afternoon, Mr. Patrick O'Neill. Can I do a quick mic check with you, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi, Jonathan. Can I do a quick mic check with you, please?
Hey, Melissa.
Hi, thank you.
Okay, we are ready to start the planning board meeting with preliminary matters. Could I get a motion on adoption of the resolutions?
I move adoption of 3 resolutions to Bethesda Metro Center preliminary plan, amendment to Bethesda Metro Center site plan amendment, and 2131 East Randolph Road Forest Conservation Plan.
And I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Jerry Shippey, aye.
Opposed? That is approved. I don't believe we have any minutes or other preliminary matters, so we can, oh, actually, we do need to approve the record plats. Is there a motion to approve the
Motion to
record plats?
approve record plats for Garrett Park, Carteret Springs, and FAES Academic Center.
And I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Jerry Shippey, aye.
Opposed? That is approved. How about, can we get a motion on the regulatory extension request?
I move approval of extension requests for Miles Coppola preliminary plan, Crossroads of Kensington site plan, Century preliminary plan, site plan and sketch plan, and Maryland Germantown 2560 site plan amendment.
And I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Jerry Shippey, aye.
Opposed? Those are approved. And I think now we can turn to the Park Director's report.
Good afternoon, Mike Riley, Director of Parks. Got a few brief slides for you today. I'll speak to this wonderful image up on the screen in a second, but I just wanted to give updates on the 2 budgets, the capital budget and the operating budget. Capital budget, we came out of the Fed committee in pretty good shape with recommended restorations, but we are hearing bad news that the council currently has the capital improvements program vastly overbooked to the tune of $150 to $200 million over the 6 years, with the big pressure being on the county's general obligation bonds. So we've had council staff reach out to us for participating in reductions. One of the things we've pushed back on, you got the great news last week about state aid coming out of Annapolis for many projects. And there was some thought on the council team that maybe we should reduce local funding in projects that receive state aid, but we've been telling them why that's a bad idea for several reasons, including the fact that that was partial funding for the projects and we need local funding to match, and we certainly don't want to send a message to our state elected officials that the reason they're bringing money to Annapolis is so that park funding can be cut locally. So we've said we'll be a team player like we always have been. If we have to participate in cuts, we'll work collectively with the council staff to where they should occur, but we're bracing that we're going to have to probably take some reductions in our capital program somewhere before the dust settles. The operating budget, we're going very late this year to Fed committee. We haven't been there yet. We're going to go Monday, May 2nd. That's hopefully going to be a very tame work session this year compared to others. We're just asking for relatively modest amounts of money to be restored in the parks and planning budget. So I hope to be able to report good news from the Fed committee next week. So this picture is an event the vice chair and I attended on Saturday, the Color and Kite Festival at Black Hill Regional Park. It was an absolutely wonderful event. I don't know if I've ever seen so many people in a parks at once. The vice chair and I each got an opportunity to address the crowd, and it was very exhilarating to be looking out and speaking to so many people and seeing so many people having a great time. Great family event, a great cultural event, and I'll just scroll through a few more slides. You can see why they call it the Color and Kite Festival. You can the color part anyway. I didn't get great shots of the kites. They're a little bit hard to see, but trust me, there were kites, hundreds of kites up in the air all day. This is just a little bit of a close-up with the different colors being tossed in the air. This is the vice chair addressing the crowd. It really doesn't do it justice because they spread out much more broadly than that photograph shows. address the crowd in both English and Hindi. And this is the vice chair and I with the event organizer, Bijal Shah. And as I was just saying to Commissioner Verma, we have all this different nomenclature for these events that happen in the park. We call ours park activation events. When it's a third party, we call them special events, which we facilitate and authorize for permits. But it really doesn't matter. It's in our park. It's a community building event. The beauty of this, besides how wonderful the event is and all its benefits, is that the third party, or in this case, Bijal and the Maryland Premier Cricket League, do 99% of the legwork to make the event happen. All the logistics, organizing county police to police the public roads, working with us to make sure that our operations and police staff are involved. And then at the end of the event, cleaning up the grounds, leaving the park pristine, just the way they came into it. So I'm sure the vice chair will want to say a few words about this event when I'm done. I just got a few more slides, but I just can't say enough about this being an exemplary type of situation that we want to be happening more and more in our parks. So that was last weekend. Just moving forward, I'm going to talk about a smattering of things that are coming up. This is part of our program that we run called Park Activation. We have sunset yoga going on tonight at Long Branch Arliss Park. Looks to be a beautiful evening. If anybody's got a little time on their hands at 6:30 tonight and wants to get a little zen and a little physical fitness, stop by Long Branch Arliss. This is another series coming up tomorrow night, one in a series of many. We're going to bring acoustics and ales to Fairview Road Urban Park, and you can see we've got a couple of our local microbreweries, food trucks, and our musical guest, the Crush Funk Brass Band. Moving on to Saturday, this is Chess in the Park, also at Fairview Road Urban Park from 10 a.m. to 1. Right across from our old headquarters. And then going back to what we call special events or third-party events, Only Days is a huge event, annual event that'll be hosted, that we will host in Olney Manor Park on Saturday afternoon from 3 p.m. Until the evening. And then the last thing I got, you probably wonder why I'd show the planning board a bag of toys. We have been outfitting our park police officers what we call sensory bags. So if they come upon a person who is in distress or agitated or has special needs that might benefit from some therapeutic objects, they carry these in their car, and they've been shown to be of value in certain situations when you have a distressed person in the parks that maybe needs to be calmed down a lot. This has been getting a lot of press as a positive things, and it's just an example of many ways our park police are trying to be as community-friendly as possible. And that's all I got. Be happy to take comments or questions.
Thank you for that. I had just a couple of comments, and it was a pleasure to attend and address the crowd at the Rangor Patang event on Saturday. And the feedback I got from the majority of people who were there, many of these individuals are immigrants who've been in the country for about 10 years or so, 10 to 15 years. And they miss their homeland. They miss celebrating Holi, which is a big festival back in India. And for them to do that in a park in Montgomery County is so special. And in many ways, especially during the pandemic where you weren't able to do international travel, many of these people will often go back home and celebrate, but they haven't had that opportunity. So thank you so much for not only doing this, but making it an exclusive event, and I'm glad that it worked out so well. Interesting enough, I had lunch with one of the organizers recently, and he mentioned that there was a $160,000 plus economic impact just from this one event, just for 5 or 6 hours or however long the period of the festival was, and that's incredible. And that's vendors, local businesses, and so that shows that our parks are being utilized. It's helping people in terms of economic value, and you get to celebrate as well. So just wanted to say thank you so much for organizing that and all these other amazing park activation. I feel like every time we have a parks report, it's always these incredible activities, and just really thankful for all that you do.
Okay, that's a fantastic event. And I was disappointed I've never been able to attend in person. Maybe next year we'll be able to do that. I will not be delivering any remarks in Hindi, but I'll do my best. Any other comments or questions for Mike? If not, we can move right along to item 7, resolution of adoption of the Corridor Forward Plan. Okay, we're ready to talk about the resolution of adoption for Corridor Forward, and with us we have Jesse Cohn-McGowan and Jess McVeary.
Thank you, Chair. Again, Jessie Cohn-McGowan for the record. The purpose of the item today is approval of the Planning Board Resolution number 22-043 to adopt Corridor Forward, the I-270 Transit Plan. The Montgomery County Council approved the plan by resolution number 19-1207 on April 5th. So, thank you.
With that, I move approval of the resolution for Corridor Forward, and I think as staff, it's a great plan, and hopefully we'll get some really good transit out of this, particularly up to the up counties. They can share in the joy of of taking transit back and forth from their homes.
And I'll second.
Great job. All in favor? Aye.
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 Jerry
Opposed?
Sishi, aye.
Very good. So that makes it unanimous. Really appreciate all your work on this. I think this was a really important project for the county to resolve a lot of questions that some people didn't even know were needed to be asked, but were really critical to a resolution to be able to move forward with some transit investments whenever they might come, hopefully sooner rather than later. So thank you. And we're going to take like about a 5 or 10 minute break here before the next item. So we'll be back shortly. Okay, we're ready for item 6, the introduction of proposed no-net loss of forest amendments to the Forest Conservation Law and Forest Conservation Tree Regulations public hearing. And for this, we have Christina Sorrento and Kristen Toddy, I believe.
Good afternoon. For the record, Kristen Taddy, Planner 3 with the Intake and Regulatory Coordination Division. Today, we are introducing proposed changes to Chapter 22A of the Montgomery County Code, the Forest Conservation Law, and Chapter 22A of the Code of Montgomery County Regulations, the Planning Board's Forest Conservation and Trees Regulations. Staff are proposing these changes as part of the department's No Net Loss of Forest initiative to achieve greater forest planting and forest conservation in Montgomery County. In addition to the proposed amendments, staff are suggesting several supplemental programs for a planning department and county council consideration. The goal of the No Net Loss of Forest initiative is to achieve a more balanced and tailored approach to forest conservation in Montgomery County by achieving an equal or greater area of forest planted compared to forest removed on a county-wide level by projects subject to the Montgomery County Forest Conservation Law. Other minor changes recommended by staff are intended to clarify and update sections of the Forest Conservation Law and regulations. Staff is recommending approval of the recommended changes for transmittal and introduction to the County Council and requesting that the proposed regulations be posted in the County Register. Montgomery County adopted its own forest conservation law after the Maryland Forest Conservation Act was enacted in 1991. The county law has since been amended 5 times to strengthen requirements and incorporate state amendments, since the county law must be at least as strict as the state law. In the past 30 years, Montgomery County's forest conservation law has resulted in permanent protection of 15,705 acres of forest, and of that area, the majority, nearly 13,000 acres, is mature forest protected by forest conservation easements. Montgomery County's forest conservation law has required planting of 2,861 acres of new forest and mitigation for the clearing of 4,400 acres of forest. In the past 10 years, the law has required planting of close to 700 acres and mitigation for the clearing of about 800 acres of forest, showing a trend towards more infill development and less forest clearing. This trend is also supported by the 2020 report examining the role of forests and trees in Montgomery County's greenhouse gas inventory, which was prepared by experts and representatives of several Montgomery County agencies, including the Planning Department and the Department of Environmental Protection. The report found that from 2011 to 2016, average annual emissions as a result of the loss of forests and trees were less than the period from 2001 to 2011, and that tree canopy in the county increased during the 2011 to 2016 time period. So while we're getting closer to achieving no net loss of forest in Montgomery County, and the law has been successful in protecting over 15,000 acres of forest, we want to see an increase in the acreage of planted forest so that it's greater than the acreage of forest cleared in the county. In November and December 2021, the Planning Department held 4 working group sessions that brought stakeholders together. During these working groups, stakeholders and planning staff shared ideas and began brainstorming to work toward these goals. Representatives from 24 different groups, including nonprofits, agency representatives, and the development community, participated in these working groups. The primary requests of nonprofit groups that we heard and discussed during the working groups were for less forest clearing, including one-to-one replacement of forests, more forest planting, and creation of forest ecosystems. The concerns we heard from the regulated community, agencies and developers primarily, centered around the cost of increased mitigation. We understand that forest mitigation is expensive, and opportunities for forest mitigation are few due to the latest state amendment, which severely reduced our ability to provide forest mitigation banks for mitigation. And any increase in required mitigation will increase costs to applicants. Planning staff worked closely with stakeholders to hear these concerns and worked creatively to propose an amendment that we believe carefully balances these requests and that considers other county priorities, such as providing housing and meeting the goals of the Climate Action Plan. In early 2022, the Planning Department's Forest Conservation staff incorporated the ideas generated during the working groups into draft amendments to the Forest Conservation Law and regulations, and circulated the drafts for peer review, legal review, and the required state review by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources to have the draft amendments reviewed for compliance with the enabling law. Before reviewing each proposed change, I'd like to review the results of 2 analyses that were done during and after the working groups. We tested possible amendments to Montgomery County's forest conservation law using 15 real projects that required forest conservation plans to comply with the law. Projects were carefully selected to ensure an even distribution of location within the county, development type, net tract area, zone, level of forest removal, and afforestation requirements. Ultimately, staff found that the amendments proposed, most importantly the proposed changes to forest conservation thresholds, afforestation requirements, and reforestation ratios, would result in higher forest mitigation required compared to forest cleared, and would incentivize less forest clearing wherever possible. And the requirement to reforest and all unforested stream valley buffers would guarantee an increase in planting across the county. So of the 15 projects we reviewed, 7 of them removed forest. The total forest removed across these 7 projects was 15.52 acres. Those same 7 projects had combined forest mitigation of 14.95 acres. If these same 7 projects were to submit applications after the proposed amendment takes effect, the required forest mitigation in the same watershed as the project or a priority watershed would be 17.58 acres. And if that mitigation took place outside the same or a priority watershed, 25.24 acres of mitigation would be required. The last line here shows the total mitigation that would be required for all 15 projects, including the 8 that did not remove forest and primarily had afforestation requirements. We also compared our proposals to the no net loss of forest amendments recently introduced by 3 other Maryland counties, Howard, Anne Arundel, and Frederick County. These 3 counties were selected as they're comparable to Montgomery County in terms of population and landscape. However, Montgomery County still has a greater population, a range of diverse landscapes, and a rate and expense of development compared to these other counties. So the amendments being proposed take all of those differences into account. Howard County increased their reforestation ratios and incentivized reforestation within the same watershed by requiring less reforestation if the reforestation was occurring in the same watershed as the project. Our proposal for Montgomery County is similar. However, we are proposing expanding the options for lower reforestation ratios to any priority watershed in addition to the same watershed as the project. In addition, the highest required reforestation would be 2.5 to 1 in Montgomery County, compared to 3 to 1 in Howard County. But all in all, we are proposing a very similar approach for the reforestation ratios. Frederick County increased their reforestation ratios, matching our proposal for Montgomery County's lowest reforestation ratios, and they also instituted a new 1-to-1 replacement requirement. Either the reforestation ratios or the 1-to-1 replacement requirement apply, depending on which one results in a greater mitigation requirement. Anne Arundel County was the only county to increase forest conservation thresholds in certain land use categories, depending on the location and net tract area. We are proposing similar increases to Montgomery County's thresholds, but in the lower density zones where there's additional space for retention and planting, rather than the higher density zones. And our proposals would apply to any size project regardless of location. So in this next section, I'll go through each of the significant proposed changes to both the law and the regulations. Starting with the proposed change in the Forest Conservation Plan Exemptions section 22A5, which excludes activities located within the commercial residential zone classification from qualifying for the S1 and S2 FCP exemptions, pertaining to activities on tracts of land less than 1 or 1.5 acres. This is one of, if not the most commonly applied for, FCP exemptions, and these project types are also receiving high density. And while the FCP exemption may have some mitigation requirements, by not needing to submit forest conservation plans, these project types are currently receiving the highest density, but providing the least forest mitigation. Staff felt that these types of projects should require forest conservation plans in order to provide a small amount of forest mitigation in exchange for the high density received.
Well, can I just ask a question about this? I mean, am I mistaken, or a lot of these properties don't have any trees on them, or certainly no forest?
That's right. Yep, and especially for the projects that would qualify for the FCP exemption, S1 and S2, they're on smaller lots, 1 to 1.5 acres in size. But similar projects that maybe don't qualify for the FCP exemption are receiving high density and still need to submit forest conservation plans. And typically what's required in those cases is an afforestation requirement. So it's the exchange for high density and providing a small amount of mitigation through afforestation that we're looking for there.
Yeah, if you're submitting a forest conservation plan, by definition, do you have to do an NRI-FSD? Or you always have to do an NRI-FSD?
Yes.
Regardless. But when you say you're saying you should submit a forest conservation plan. I mean, when we see forest conservation plans, looks like some, basically landscape architects type, drawings that are very detailed of the site and documenting where the trees are or not. Mm-hmm. I mean, you were literally talking about something like that, or are you just saying that somebody who is applying to build something on a site that doesn't have any forest ought to have to contribute towards some kind of afforestation? Because that's a little bit, maybe I'm wrong, but that seems like that's a little bit different question.
I think it's both, but go ahead.
Christina Sorrento for the record. So they would have to submit a forest conservation plan, but when there's no forest on site, it's a little bit easier to pull together. And so, obviously you're not documenting trees that don't exist on the site, so it's a much easier plan to look at. But really what applies here is an afforestation, which means you have a certain amount of planting that you have to do. That's the case with any land that is subject to forest conservation law that doesn't have forest on it. If it's a certain size and a certain area, it is required to do some sort of planting, a certain amount of planting. And so that's just removing the exemption so that they have to be reviewed to look and see what kind of planting they would have to provide.
Okay, thanks.
So staff are also proposing a requirement that natural resource inventories and forest stand delineations be approved prior to and submitted with certain development plans. In some cases, currently, NRI-FSDs are submitted with a development plan for review rather than prior to the development plan being submitted. This change would require an approved NRI-FSD to be submitted with the application package for these plan types. This proposal would ensure that all environmental features are considered before development and are known and properly assessed at the time the development plan is submitted to the Planning Department for review. The primary goal with this change is to ensure that high-quality forest is properly considered and preserved wherever possible. Planning staff are proposing increases to certain forest conservation thresholds. The forest conservation threshold is a percentage of the net tract area, which differs depending on the land use category or zone for the project. If less than this area of forest is cleared, then there's a lower required reforestation ratio. If more than this area of forest is cleared, there's a higher reforestation ratio. So here's a quick example. A project with a net tract area of 100 acres, 70 acres of which are in forest cover. So with a land use category of medium density residential, the conservation threshold according to the current forest conservation law is 25% or 25 acres. This means that for this particular site, the area of forest above the threshold is 45 acres. So a proposal to clear 40 acres would be clearing above the threshold or clearing less forest and would trigger a lower reforestation ratio of 1/4 to 1. While a proposal to clear 55 acres would be clearing below the threshold or clearing more forest and would trigger a higher reforestation ratio of 2 to 1 for the area of forest cleared above the threshold. Staff are proposing increased or stronger forest conservation thresholds in lower density land use categories where additional open space exists for forest preservation or planting. These land use categories include the medium density residential, cluster medium density residential, agricultural and resource areas, and institutional land use categories. Cluster medium density residential is a new category introduced as part of this proposed amendment and would include the rural cluster, rural neighborhood cluster, and RE2C zones. The medium density residential land use category would continue to include the RE1 and RE2 zones. Staff felt that increasing forest conservation thresholds in the cluster medium density residential land use categories was appropriate since these cluster developments provide more yield within the zone, allowing for remaining open space to be preserved as forest or planted. So here's an example of how this proposed amendment would result in a stronger forest mitigation requirement. And just to assuage any concerns, I'm going to show 3 examples of real projects, and these changes would not be retroactive and would only apply to new projects moving forward if these changes are adopted. But as an example, this project required a sediment control forest conservation plan for the purposes of establishing a veterinary hospital on an existing recorded lot. With the forest conservation law as is, the project was not required to meet a mitigation requirement due to on-site retention, even though 0.44 acres of forest was removed. Increasing the forest conservation threshold from 50 to 55% in agricultural zones would result in a forest mitigation requirement of 0.17 acres if the requirement is met in the same or priority watershed, or 0.39 acres if the requirement is met elsewhere within the county. Planning staff are also proposing increases to the afforestation requirements. The afforestation threshold is also a percentage of the net tract area, which differs depending on the land use category or zone for the project. If no forest or less than this area of forest exists on the site, projects must meet an afforestation requirement to create at least this much forest. For required afforestation, the proposed changes would increase requirements from 15 to 20% in higher density land use categories if the net tract area is less than 5 acres in the high density residential, mixed use, and commercial industrial land use categories. Afforestation requirements in institutional land use categories would increase to 20% regardless of whether the net tract area is less than 5 acres. Afforestation is typically required to meet requirements for projects that remove little to no forest. Therefore, staff felt that it would be appropriate and reasonable to increase afforestation requirements for projects with smaller net tract areas that may be receiving higher density. Analysis of several projects on larger institutional properties indicated there would be additional space on those property types to accommodate a slightly greater afforestation requirement. Here's an example of how this proposed amendment would result in stronger forest mitigation. So Carteret Springs was an administrative subdivision plan in Bethesda that proposed to demolish the existing home and subdivide one lot into 2 for a new single-family dwelling on each lot. There was no on-site forest, and in this case, the afforestation requirements were fully addressed on-site. With the no net loss proposals, the afforestation requirement would increase to 1/4 acre as a result of the afforestation requirement increasing from 15 to 20% in high-density residential zones if the net tract area is less than 5 acres. Since this project had no forest on site and did not propose to clear any forest, the forest conservation threshold and reforestation ratios would not apply, which is why the resulting afforestation requirement would be the same, 1/4 acre, regardless of the location of mitigation.
Can we go back to that example that you just gave? So in this instance, under the new requirements, you would be required to do 1/4 acre in the same priority watershed, and then in addition, you would also have to do it outside as well?
No,
or is it just one or the other?
In this case, right, it would be one or the other. So the afforestation requirements, it's the reforestation ratios that have that differentiation between the same or priority watershed. We were just keeping the tables consistent across these projects. So it would be one 1/4 acre requirement that could be met anywhere in the county.
So this 1/4 acre requirement that you just referred to, do we have a general sense of what kind of cost is associated with that?
Generally, the number that I go with is about $30,000 an acre for planting. But then if that's met through fee in lieu payment, that's $1.30 per square foot, which is closer to $55,000 an acre. So it's somewhere in that range.
So in this
usually.
case, this would be around $7,000 or
Right.
so. And if you couldn't do it, then you do a payment in lieu.
Right, typically fee in lieu is one of the last options, but in some cases with a small requirement like this, it's allowed, and you don't have to go through a bank or another alternative.
Got it. Thank you.
So could you explain to me why, on this example, there's not a distinction between forest mitigation in the same or priority watershed? Because my understanding is, versus outside, because my understanding is we're trying to motivate planting either within the same watershed. I know that there's been no loss, but I would think more the priority watersheds are really where we're looking, because those are the ones that need more forest. So why would there not be a difference to create that motivation? Not necessarily because it's within the same or outside, but not in a priority watershed.
I'm just going to move forward to demonstrate that a little bit. So this slide is showing the reforestation ratios, which are only triggered if the forest conservation threshold is triggered. And a forest conservation threshold is only triggered if there's forest on the site. So for an afforestation ratio, these types of projects that typically need to meet an afforestation ratio, they're either clearing 0 acres, such as in this case, or very little forest. So for that reason, that's why we are continuing or proposing to continue allow afforestation to be met in anywhere in the county, because they're not removing forest to begin with. But for the reforestation ratios, there's often forest clearing involved with those types of projects. So that's why we felt like if forest is being removed, then there should be incentive to replant or mitigate as close to the project as possible, or where we'd really like to see reforestation in the county, such as where there's been forest decline.
Right. I'm just wondering whether there should be additional motivation to get somebody to plant within, even if there's no forest removal, but to put trees in the area or forest in an area where it's really more like the priority areas where it's needed more.
I think it's something we can definitely take a look at.
Okay.
Did you want to add anything, Christina?
Yes, I was just going to say the afforestation amount is just a straight percentage. And, if you were to break it up like that, then you would come up with a percentage for within and percentage for without.
Well, I'm
outside
thinking
of it.
actually of creating a carrot rather than a stick, is that if somebody would be able to plant and find something in a priority watershed, which are generally the down county urban areas, that they should get some benefit from it. Perhaps not have as high of an afforestation, since they're not clearing, so they're not taking away, and regardless, there's increased forest because you're putting something there that was not, you're putting in a forest that wasn't there, that you didn't clear. So perhaps that would be a good opportunity to push people to plant in areas where it's needed more.
Right.
Yep, I agree with that, and I think one way that we could look at doing that is by increasing these percentages that you can see on this slide if the mitigation or if the afforestation is going to occur, again, in the same or a priority watershed.
I'd kind of look at reducing it if you put it in a priority area.
Oh, yeah.
Only because
To
of the
incentivize.
concern with the cost. You're not taking away forest, so it's not a loss, but you're giving an incentive to try to find an area where we really want to have forests, which is in the down county and the priority areas.
Right. What you could do is increase for any planting that is outside of the priority areas, but keep it the same for any planting that occurs, afforestation that occurs within the priority areas.
Okay, so staff are proposing a new structure for the required reforestation ratios in order to incentivize mitigation in the same watershed as the proposed project, or a watershed designated as priority for forest conservation by planning staff. Priority watersheds will be those with the highest rate of forest loss, development pressure, and lowest stream water quality values. These proposed changes increase reforestation ratios from the current 1/4 to 1 for clearing above the threshold to 1/2 to 1 and 1 to 1, depending on the location of mitigation. The higher ratio would be required if forest mitigation were to occur outside of the same watershed as the project or a priority watershed. Staff's proposal would retain the current 2-to-1 ratio for clearing below the threshold, but this would increase to 2.5-to-1 if mitigation were to take place outside of the same watershed as the project or a priority watershed. Here's an example of how this proposed amendment would result in stronger forest mitigation. The Wilgus project proposed development of 107 townhomes, 34 2-over-2 units, and a multifamily building near the White Flint Metro Station. 11.3 acres of forest existed on site, and all was proposed for removal. Since the area of forest to be cleared was above the forest conservation threshold, both the 1/4-to-1 and 2-to-1 reforestation ratios applied, resulting in an 8.15 acre forest mitigation requirement. The proposed higher reforestation ratios would result in a 10.21 acre mitigation requirement if mitigation occurs in the same or a priority watershed, and 15.86 acres if mitigation occurs elsewhere within the county. Currently, unforested stream valley buffers must be reforested in special protection areas and within the Patuxent management area. Staff are proposing to expand this requirement to apply to all unforested stream valley buffers in the county, except if reforestation or afforestation of the stream valley buffer conflicts with one of the natural resource management goals of the Department of Parks, such as designated meadow habitat, or an allowable use for stream valley buffers per the environmental guidelines. So after reading testimony submitted by the Parks Department, staff are suggesting several additional changes to this section, which are shown here in bold, to ensure that stream valley buffers are not planted in certain cases, such as if afforestation or reforestation would conflict with the mission and established stewardship practices of the Parks Department, or if the condition of the stream valley buffer is not suitable for reforestation.
I had a question. If you can go back to the example that you provided with regards to the application and right off of Montrose. And Gwen, I'm probably going to look to you for this one. I remember this project because when we were reviewing it, the land and the current conditions, the existing conditions of the quote forest were not so great. And these were trees that actually had not only had invasive, but they were dying. And I guess my question for staff as well as for the director is, we keep on using this word forest. Not all forest is created equal. If we're removing a good application that we had last week with regards to the Lytle application, also was a site that had a tremendous amount of invasive species as well. If we are removing those and dead trees, and of course every living entity has a lifespan of sorts, how are we defining forest? And, in terms of legal, I guess I should probably get the attorneys involved in this conversation as well. The nexus between requiring someone to do something that may not necessarily apply to the existing conditions for a particular site, these are questions that come to mind.
Sure, and I can start, but then I'm sure Christina and Kristen can also respond. There is a specific definition in the law of what forest is, and I'm going to let them talk about what that definition is. But I want to say that when we review these cases, there are always judgments that are made. In the case that we talked about with Wilgus, if that had been really, really high-quality forest that didn't have a lot of the problems that you identified, we may have recommended not to clear it. There is nothing that's a given saying that you absolutely are allowed to clear. And that's where the judgment, I think, comes in about what is the quality of the resource that's being discussed. I think one of the things that definitely went into the thinking on the Wilgus property was an acknowledgement of some of the challenging qualities of that area that met the legal definition of forest. And that's why staff actually recommended allowing it to be cleared with the mitigation that was required. But in a different, again, completely, fantasy situation, if you had a similar case where the 11.3 acres of forest were really high quality, were really intact, then the staff recommendation may well have been not to approve clearing of any of it. But I'll let the definition of forest go to Kristen.
Right, so I'll read the definition of forest, but it is very specifically defined in the Forest Conservation Law, but the way it's defined, it can still include, invasive species, and even invasive trees. And there's gonna be a proposal coming up, where we would like to see in certain cases where forest is, heavily invased, or where it's meeting the definition of forest, but it's low quality, where in certain cases we could require a maintenance and management plan to improve the quality of that forest. So forest means a biological community dominated by trees and other woody plants, covering a land area which is 10,000 square feet or greater and at least 50 feet wide. And then forest includes areas that have at least 100 live trees per acre, with at least 50% of those trees having a 2-inch or greater diameter at 4.5 feet from the ground, and forest areas that have been cut but not cleared, such as for timber harvesting.
Is that a state or a county definition?
This is the definition in the county law, and it is stronger than the state law as well.
So in this scenario, the status quo was that they had to provide 8.15 acres of mitigation. Under the new amendment, if it's in the same priority watershed, it would be 10.2. If they can't do it in the same priority watershed, if it's outside, then are they forced to then do the 15.86?
That's correct.
So that's almost a double of what you would be normally required.
Right.
So in this scenario, and this is just specific to this application, I have trouble understanding when the forest in this instance that we recognize is problematic. It was not what we would refer to as a high quality forest. And the mitigation that's required is 8 acres. There is a scenario where your costs could go double for 15 acres. And I think what you said, it was $30,000 per acre. Is that the number you said?
Right, that's sort of a rule of thumb that I
So
can
we're
choose.
looking at an additional cost of $475,000 for mitigation outside of the watershed if it's not available. And so that gives me some pause, because I don't see a nexus between replacing the forest that I guess it meets the technical definition of a forest in the way you described it, but having walked that property myself and seeing where it was located, looking at the forest mitigation that's required under the current status quo, which is pretty substantial to begin with, even comparing it to the conditions on the ground, and then looking at the amendment that could potentially double that. Can you provide a justification for why that should be the case?
Well, let me say one thing about this, which is I think we have to go back to the reason we're even going through this exercise. So the reason we're going through this exercise is that there is a concern that has been expressed by many people in the community, but also by many members of our council, that we should be moving towards a no net loss of forest. And that we should be keeping up with the requirements that are being imposed by neighboring jurisdictions. So what staff has been working to try to do is to take that goal and figure out how to do it as in as balanced a way as possible, so that when we see 11.3 acres of forest cleared, that we aren't just ending up with 8.15 acres of mitigation, that we're getting closer to 11. And if you can plant within the same or priority watershed, it still isn't quite at 11. It's 10.21 acres. But it's getting closer to that no net loss goal. So, I think maybe that's a baseline
Well,
decision is, does the board agree that we should be working towards the no net loss goal?
well, I think I kind of wanted to get to that at some point, maybe now's as good a time as any, but before, can we come back to this basic question of to what extent are we losing forest? Because I saw some emails with some numbers that were at odds with my understanding of the facts. So I'd just like to understand, like we got some emails that said we lost something like 1,000 acres of forest over X period of time, and that's not my understanding of what's happened. So maybe you could just address, and the other thing was, just in the cases that you talked about at the beginning of the staff report, we also got some correspondence from BIA that said that they had identified some other projects that added some more forest. So on the specific calculations that staff made, they're saying, no, actually there was no loss of forest even in that limited time frame and that you are looking at as a snapshot. So could you just address, are we in fact losing forest cover? Because the one piece of data that I'm pretty confident about is, because I got it from planning staff a while ago, is that forest cover in the county was 25% or so in 1950, and as 2016 it was about 29%. So I think it's, as far as I'm aware, there's no dispute that we have more forest cover today than we did half a century ago. What's happened in the past decade, I'm less sure about. I've never asked that question directly, but I wanted to know if you could just maybe ground us in a better understanding of, is the premise correct that we are in fact losing forest?
So you're right, there's no dispute of the increase in forest during that time period. We haven't redone that analysis more recently, so that's the latest that we have on that. But that considers forest on a countywide scale. The county forest conservation law only considers the existence and removal of forest for projects that must comply with the county's forest conservation law. So there are projects, perhaps, for example, led by the state, like Purple Line, that might have removed forest and or planted forest, and those projects aren't counted in the data that's showing on this screen, for example. So we can really only speak to the amount of forest cleared and planted through the projects that have to comply with the law. That's what we have data on. And, as I was saying in the beginning of the presentation, I think that the forest conservation law has been successful at protecting existing mature forest. I think that's where it's done very well for the county. And you can even see, if you look at the first two bullet points in both of these sections, that over the past 30 years, there has been more clearing than forest planted, and that gap has narrowed in the past 10 years. So I think it's slowing. But the recommendations that we're proposing today, I think are reasonable and constrained, and we are trying to find increases and equally distribute the increased mitigation across projects so that we're not burdening any one type of project or stakeholder group. And that's why we're seeing small increases in afforestation and small increases in the reforestation ratios to try to flip the script on the amount of forest that's cleared versus the amount of forest that's planted. We want to see the amount of forest planted be greater than the amount of forest cleared. That's the goal of the initiative.
Well, okay, but I guess I'm still confused because, on the second part of it, the 805 versus 693, BIA has provided some numbers for some additional projects where they're saying if you include those more recent projects, you actually come out making up that difference of 112 acres. So, which is not to say that that's the ultimate end goal, to just come out even. But I'm just saying, if the whole premise of the project is we're trying to get no net loss of forest, we at least ought to be able to understand, are we in fact achieving it? Or are we not? And by how much? Because some of these requirements in the existing law have afforestation requirements that require people to plant trees where they're not taking any down. So, I mean, there's probably a very plausible case that it would be good to plant trees on sites that don't have any trees on them. But that's a little bit different question than, should we be trying for no net loss of trees overall, or what does that mean? Does that mean on a watershed basis? Does that mean on a countywide basis? Because I just think there's just not a lot of, at least I'm not clear on what is the benchmark against which we're measuring no net loss? Is it on a countywide basis? Is it just for projects that are covered by the forest conservation law, or what?
It's on a countywide basis. So that's why we're looking at basically increasing requirements across all different types of projects, including those that don't remove any forest, and trying to keep the increases minimal for projects that do remove forest. And also trying to disincentivize the removal of forest wherever possible through these increases. And, I think the benchmark is going to be how much forest is being cleared. And, this is data from annual reporting going back to 1992. So we would.
But I think that Casey's question, which is a very challenging question, is all we can report on are the projects that have to go through the forest conservation law.
Yes.
So there may be situations where, the purple line is a good example. The purple line didn't go through the forest conservation law, so it took down trees, but that's not included in any of the numbers you see on this screen. We may also have situations where in a different part of the county, someone planted a tree farm because they chose to plant a tree farm. That wasn't done through the forest conservation law. Those numbers aren't included on this screen. So the only things that we actually have the ability to give you a rational measurement on are things that we have actually touched in a way through the forest conservation law and that we have records on. We don't have records on someone in the different part of the county planting a tree farm. We just don't know how many trees are there. We probably could find out how many trees were cleared as part of the purple line, but that's not in the numbers that you see here.
Well, okay, but just, I understand the difficulty in pinning this down, I think, or at least some of the difficulties. On this point of state projects, this is another thing I noticed about some of these emails say you should prohibit planting outside the county, which my understanding is we already do. So I think there's maybe some misunderstanding about how the county's forest conservation law works as opposed to the state's. County projects that are reviewed under the county's forest conservation law are not allowed to plant off-site outside the county. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right, okay. So the Purple Line or a Managed Lanes project or something like that, that's different. State can do what the state wants to do within the bounds of the state's forest conservation law. Our law is more restrictive. It does not allow for replanting outside the county's boundaries. So maybe that's just useful just to get out on the table for one thing. But you're right. I think Gwen's point is a good one, that we may miss in our calculations the loss of trees as part of state projects that are allowed to plant outside the county. The flip side, though, is my understanding is, I think you told me last week, that some land that is taken out of agriculture winds up adding forest because, what was previously a pasture or a meadow or some open land is now winds up either forest regenerates, on its own, or somebody replants the trees, and that may be significant in terms of the amount of forest you're talking about. So there may be both additions and subtractions from the net amount of forest due to factors that are outside the scope of the county's forest conservation law. Is that about right?
Yes, and also something I would like to mention is, as we said, this is only covering, what we see through the forest conservation law. Any parcel or lot that is under 40,000 square feet in size and is clearing forest, that is not being accounted for at all here. And that's a lot of your infill development and all of that as well, so.
And on the other end of it, if a significant piece of land is acquired, like by our Parks Department, that has a lot of trees on it that are going to be preserved, but there's no work being done, so no NRIFSD or forest conservation plan is approved, but we know that those trees are, in essence, being protected, but they aren't counted in what you see on the screen because they just are, they are remaining as they have existed for years. So this doesn't take into account, again, a lot of situations. I honestly don't know, and, you know, staff may have thoughts, how you would try to get a truly holistic number of what's been lost and what's been gained in the county. I think it's virtually impossible.
Well, I don't know how that project was done that came up with the numbers as of 2016, but I assume that that was based on imagery, that you're using like satellite photos to, and some of that's pretty sophisticated now. You can understand the very granular land uses based
Absolutely.
on just the overhead images.
Yep. That's definitely how it's done. You take aerial imagery and, through GIS analysis can determine what area is tree canopy, and there's even more sophisticated analysis that determines forest from tree cover. So that's probably what was used for the 2016 data, but what it doesn't show is just really an area, and then divided by the area of the county. It doesn't show where forest gains and losses are within that area necessarily, so it's simply a percentage, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, well, maybe we can come back to this, but there's one specific thing that you'd gotten to that I wanted to address before I forgot about it, which was the comments the Parks Department made about planting of stream buffers. I think that's great that, you worked out some kind of language that accommodated that concern, but it seems to me that the substance of what the Parks Department was saying there is true of non-parks properties, namely that certain stream buffers are not suitable for planting, not because they're the Parks Department's, but because if you try to plant on them, the trees are going to basically wash away because these are pieces of their soil that's often inundated or is subject to frequent, high water type events, and then you've got like debris floating down the stream, and that's not good for anybody. So I guess my question is would it be appropriate to recognize that limitation for other projects as well, not just the Parks Department?
I suppose it would. I think we were thinking of this in the terms that, the Parks Department sort of owns and manages the large majority of stream valley buffers in the county, and many of them are, wild spaces where where it's more likely to have issues with erosion, be impacted, from outflow from development and things like that. But I think that's something we can look at.
Well, my suggestion would be maybe we would just include some provision that says the same standard should be applied to private property, subject to the review of whoever the forest conservation staff person is from planning who's reviewing the forest conservation plan. So if you're an applicant to say, yeah, I'm not dedicating this land to the Parks Department, or the Parks Department doesn't want it, or for whatever reason there's a stream buffer that's going to remain in private ownership, perhaps the same consideration should be applied during the forest conservation review to say, okay, maybe we don't want to actually require planting in this area because it won't work.
Actually, I'd like to go a step a little bit different than that, and maybe address it not as that afforestation or reforestation, but considering the natural condition of the stream buffer, that perhaps there could be another mechanism, like starting to establish an ecosystem, or putting undergrowth, if there's, something where, obviously we don't want any of these materials, washing into the streams through floods, but if it's something that is appropriate to try to stabilize the area in another way, other than planting trees, I'd like to see some creativity in working with those specific natural conditions, if possible. So it's more than just saying, you get a get out of jail free card because the stream buffer's in a flood area. What I'd like to see, at least for the private sector side of it, which is what where the chair was going, I'd still like to see some mechanism for stabilization with some kind of green, if that's the best way to do it. I mean, I don't know. I'm not an expert in that. I'm not technical, but clearly those parties who are and are looking at the plans and working with the applicants could come up with something that would be appropriate from both, would be appropriate from a technical standpoint as far as protection of this, from erosion, continued erosion of those stream buffers.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is, again, looking at the language that's up on the screen, that maybe there would be there's a small I, a small double I, that maybe there would be a small triple I that would say something like, if afforestation or reforestation is not possible, a substitute protective environmental treatment must be implemented, or something to that effect.
Or maybe
Those aren't-
consider it as an alternative to tree planting or forest planting.
Right. I think the one thing I do want to say is, I mean, we are trying to make sure that we can be flexible enough to address every situation that comes up, and that's important, and it's a good thing. I don't want us to minimize the importance of planting in stream buffers. I mean, we have had conversations with people in the community about, well, this was sort of naturalization of a stream. They didn't like that idea because you had to cut some trees down to reinstall appropriate banks and create a stream that could be planted and hold the trees and be ultimately naturalized.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
I'm
I
aware
think
that
we-
I'm aware there are people who don't like these stream restoration projects. I have to say, I've spoken to many of the technical experts we have, particularly in the Parks Department. I just think that is just not a well-placed objection. I understand they don't like it. I
Right.
understand they don't like heavy equipment being moved into the woods and into the stream, and it's disruptive and sometimes means trees come down, but I think that the weight of expert opinion is on the side of these projects are
Yeah,
good
we
for water
agree.
quality.
We
Yeah.
agree. And I think the point I'm just trying to make is that planting in stream buffers is, in many, many circumstances, the exact right thing to do. And we are trying to cover ourselves for the circumstances, which I think are the minority of the time, not the majority, where it may be problematic and that we need a different approach. But I don't want to give the message to our applicants, particularly in the private sector, that we're basically saying planting in a stream buffer is sort of the, last alternative. I think
No.
it should be the first alternative.
Well,
and
neither
then,
do I, but that's why I think, the Parks Department, we can rely on to make, because they take environmental stewardship not just seriously, but as their primary mission, in fact. But as to private applicants, I'm not proposing to give them carte blanche, but just to give our reviewers the ability to consider whether or not it's a good idea in a particular case to do something else.
Yeah, and
That's
I
all.
think, and actually our reviewers do that in a lot of ways already. They'll move trees around and put them only where they can thrive and not in the areas they can't. Or they've also worked with developers to create meadow habitat, in areas that don't support trees. So I think we can add something in here too.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do, if I'm not mistaken, if you want to correct me, is be less prescriptive in the mode of protection, to try to rely on the technical experts that we have, both in the planning department and in the parks department, and look at, every site is different, all right? And so the idea is that to look at it, and these are all going to be reviewed as far as conservation plans. So I'm trying to get away from the prescriptive requirements that may not, in many cases, be the best solution, environmental solution to protect the natural resources, and to allow the experts that we have on staff to work with both the applicants and, and in some cases with the Parks Department to find what is the best solution and move forward that way. So I'm just getting nervous about the prescriptive language in some of these, like, this is the first priority, this is the second priority. I think we have demonstrated for many, many years that our parks and planning environmental, scientists have the capability to work with the applicants on specific, requirements. And I like to see that happen.
I think that's very possible here. I like the idea. And, I agree with that. We don't want to lose this provision to plant stream valley buffers where it makes sense. This is one of the only specific planting requirements in the proposal. But at the same time, we want to balance, those situations where it doesn't necessarily make sense to put forest in a stream valley buffer, or where a different type of habitat makes sense. So I think that solution will work, and we'll work on some additional language there. All right, I'll move on. So currently, if an applicant finds that the forest mitigation required of them per the forest conservation law is not possible, they must provide the maximum possible on-site retention in combination with on-site reforestation or afforestation. If the entire mitigation requirement cannot be met on-site, staff's policy is to allow the remainder of this requirement to occur off-site. Staff are proposing to incorporate this policy into the law for applicants in these cases so that they would be required to meet the remainder of required forest mitigation off-site through a combination of afforestation or reforestation at a 1-to-1 ratio or forest retention at a 2-to-1 ratio, both of which can occur off-site.
I hate to get into more specifics because we do need to hear from everybody, but could we just flag this to come back to it? Because,
Sure.
Thanks, if you could just remind me. I didn't want to go through this line by line before we had the public have a chance to talk.
Okay, so we'll come back to it at the end then.
Thank you.
Sure. Currently, all forest planting required per a forest conservation plan must have a 5-year maintenance and management agreement. This change would allow environmental reviewers the option to require a maintenance and management agreement for low-quality forest stands, such as those with a high percentage of invasive species. Not all retained forest stands would require maintenance. This is just an option, but this change ensures that invasive management and supplemental plantings are provided when needed to ensure we're protecting and giving credit for high-quality, resilient forests. So again, we noticed recently that there was, first of all, some confusion about this section in the law as written, and then secondly, after reviewing testimony from the Parks Department, which detailed some concerns with this section, we're proposing the additional changes shown in bold on this slide. The intent with this change is to allow Planning Department forest conservation staff to determine when a maintenance and management agreement is necessary for areas of existing forest, not to require one for all areas of existing forest. The additional changes shown here in bold make that clear and also state the intent of the change, which is to ensure the long-term health of forest stands being preserved to meet the requirements of the law. An additional change allows a forest management plan for parkland to be accepted in lieu of a management agreement for existing forest. Currently, applicants that propose to remove variance trees outside of forest must replant at a minimum ratio of 1 caliper inch replaced for every 4 inches of trunk diameter removed. The proposed changes to this section expand the replanting requirement to apply to all variance trees proposed for removal, regardless of whether they're located within or outside a forest. This proposed addition would allow applicants and planning department review staff to work together to implement an alternative methodology to establish planted forest as required by a forest conservation plan if it's appropriate for the site. An alternative method, such as planting smaller trees and shrubs at a higher density, referred to in some instances as the Miyawaki method, may be a better method to establish forest ecosystem depending on the unique conditions of the site and may establish a resilient forest ecosystem more quickly. However, the density and survival requirements detailed in the same section of the regulations would still need to be met at a minimum to ensure standards are being implemented equally across projects. In addition to the alternative method, 2 proposed additions to the regulations would require new notes on forest conservation plans, one to indicate whether downed woody material will be retained in retention, afforestation, or reforestation areas to build habitat, and another to indicate whether soil restoration techniques will be implemented. Planning department staff may require either of these techniques to repurpose downed woody material in a beneficial way to build microhabitats in retained or planted forest areas, or to improve the soil microbiome. Soil profile rebuilding has been conditioned by the board in the past and is especially important in forest planting areas with a history of agriculture or development. Currently, landscaping is the last option in the preferred sequence for meeting forest mitigation requirements and can be used to meet either a reforestation or an afforestation requirement anywhere in the county. Staff are proposing to limit the use of landscaping to meet requirements. If adopted, this change would only allow landscaping to meet a reforestation or afforestation requirement in equity focus areas of Montgomery County. The intent with this proposed change is to encourage tree planting wherever possible in areas of the county characterized by high concentrations of lower-income households, people of color, and individuals who may speak English less than very well. These are also areas of the county where fewer trees and less forest tends to exist, so we want to ensure every option can be used to provide trees and green spaces for communities in these areas. Outside of the equity focus areas, landscaping would only be allowed to be used to meet afforestation requirements, which are required of projects removing little to no forest relative to the net tract area of the site. In addition to the proposed amendment, staff are considering several adjustments to our existing programs that would support stronger forest conservation in the county. They include possible yearly nominations for projects with the best outcomes for forest in Montgomery County, such as those that achieve a significant net gain in forest or go above and beyond the requirements of this chapter. We're also considering and working on a supplemental list of fast-growing native tree and shrub species that are resilient to deer browse, changing climate, sun exposure, and invasive pressure to accelerate canopy closure and establishment. And finally, we're considering the option to expand public benefits to include the establishment of microforests, forests established using alternative methods, purchasing credits from an off-site existing forest retention bank, and increasing the use of off-site forest planting or retention and planting street trees. And there are several supportive programs we would encourage the County Council to consider in order to provide assistance to applicants who either go above and beyond the requirements of this chapter or propose affordable or attainable housing in meeting their forest mitigation requirements. And we would also request additional forest conservation staff so we may be able to better support applicants seeking opportunities for forest mitigation. Thank you. That concludes the presentation, and we're happy to answer further questions. Chair Anderson, did you want to go back to that slide?
Let's do that after we hear from the members of the public who wanted to testify, but I just want to take a 2-minute break before I do that. But I want to tell everybody who's up so they can compose their thoughts. We're going to hear from Eric Fisher, Marissa Elzewski, Sylvia Tognetti, Denise Gutera, Carolyn Taylor, Sheldon Fishman, Naomi Bolanos, Allison Sweeney, Craig Carlson, Shruti Bhatnagar. In that order, those are the folks who are coming online, and then we'll get to the folks who are here in person. So we'll be just a minute. Okay, we are ready to hear from the folks who signed up to testify, starting with Eric Fisher. I think we see Mr. Fisher.
Thank you, Chair Anderson, members of the board. My name is Eric Fisher. I am the Maryland Assistant Director at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation in Annapolis. I'm also an urban planner, and I am honored to be speaking on behalf of our Montgomery County membership this afternoon. First, I want to say how much we appreciate the planning department taking this issue on, recognizing the challenge facing the county with regard to forest loss. As you all know, this is not a simple law, and I know the planning department has done a ton of work to get to this point. We also appreciate the open access and the communication that we've had with planning staff over the last few months as they have been working on this bill. We support many pieces of the legislation that are in front of you, including moving the NRI FSD forward in the process, increasing conservation thresholds, increasing afforestation on smaller lots, and reforesting stream valley buffers. That latter practice is one of the single most cost-effective practices that can be undertaken to clean up local waterways in the Chesapeake Bay. That said, we think that this legislation needs to be stronger in order to fully achieve no net loss of forest. CBF has worked extensively with other counties who have strengthened their forest conservation acts over the years. And as was mentioned earlier in this presentation, Montgomery County closely mirrors both Howard and Anne Arundel County's efforts. I think it's important to recognize that neither Howard nor Anne Arundel aspired to or achieved no net loss with those proposals. Chesapeake Bay Foundation is part of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition. You will hear from other members of that coalition this afternoon. And together we have proposed a number of amendments to strengthen the bill. I want to touch briefly on two. One is increasing the base replanting ratio from 1/4 to 1 to 2 to 1. 2 to 1 sounds like a lot, but there are many deductions that come off of that. This is why the planning department's proposal, while doubling the base reforestation ratio, would only increase replanting by 17%. So we need that higher ratio in order to get us to true no net loss. The other piece that I would like to touch on briefly for you this afternoon is making sure that the rules that require replanting actually result in replanting. Getting to no net loss means replacing every acre of forest that is cut down. If you have a 10-acre replanting requirement, but you satisfy that entire requirement by preserving existing trees elsewhere, then the county has experienced a 10-acre net loss. And what we've seen, especially in recent years, is that the vast majority of the mitigation credits that are offered are preservation of existing trees, not replanting new trees. Preservation is good, but if it is out of balance, the county will experience no net loss, even at a very high base replanting requirement. So we're proposing an amendment that 75% of the replanting requirement actually be satisfied by planting. And we think that this regulatory driver is essential in order to encourage newly planted areas in the county. Happy to answer any questions. Appreciate your time this afternoon.
Thank you. Is Marissa Elzewski there? And I'm going to apologize in advance for mispronouncing anybody's name.
That's fine, thank you.
Was I in the ballpark?
Yes, thank you, Chair Anderson and Planning Board members, for your opportunity for me to speak to you today on the proposed no net loss of forest amendments. My name is Marissa Olszewski. I am the Environmental Policy Manager for the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and I'm testifying today on behalf of our Montgomery County constituency. Maryland LCV works across Maryland, including in Montgomery County, to activate Marylanders to promote and pass equitable laws and policies for clean water, healthy air, and a resilient climate. In 2020, Maryland LCV worked with students in University of Maryland's School of Public Policy to compile a report on the state of the Maryland Forest Conservation Act and local forest protection laws. In part, the report noted weaknesses in Montgomery County's current law, finding that it did not adequately protect contiguous forest and did not require adequate years of maintenance post-reforestation to restore a vibrant ecosystem. I applaud the Planning Department for their proposed changes, which do strengthen areas of weakness in the current law. However, Maryland LCB agrees with the Montgomery County Forest Coalition that additional provisions are necessary to achieve protection of essential natural resources and maintain a high quality of life for county residents. Forest ecosystems are vital natural resources. They are natural infrastructure for soil retention and sediment reduction, supporting clean water. Forests improve air quality as natural filters for particulate matter and air pollutants. They are our best mitigation tool against climate change, sequestering carbon and providing localized cooling. And studies show when people are in proximity to forests, their mental health benefits and quality of life improves with reduced stress and anxiety levels. For these reasons, Maryland LCB is in agreement with the Montgomery County Forest Coalition's recommendations. We urge the Planning Board to further amend the proposed ordinance and develop the strongest possible protections for Montgomery County's forests. Specific amendments should accomplish the following 4 important recommendations. Number 1, first and foremost, protect existing forest ecosystems and prioritize contiguous forests. The best way to achieve no net forest loss is through protection of existing stock. Number 2, provide clear standards for forest ecosystem establishments, updating the local environmental technical guide to ensure the reestablishment of whole forest ecosystems. Number 3, strengthen replanting ratios to 2 to 1. 2 acres planted for every 1 acre removed should be the base reforestation ratio. And 4th, strengthen requirements of replanting to expand contiguous forest and remain in the same subwatershed when development is occurring. A replanting ratio of more than 2 to 1 should be required when replanting cannot be achieved within the local watershed. These recommendations have been thoughtfully considered and are reflected in the Montgomery County Forest Coalition drafted legislative language that has been submitted to you. Montgomery County has proven itself to be a leader in many wise community policies. Maryland LCB hopes your board will recommend the adoption of the strongest possible forest protection laws to the County Council and prove no exception to your leadership in this regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Sylvia Tognetti.
Good afternoon, Chair Anderson and members of the Planning Board. And my name is Sylvia Tognetti. I am testifying on behalf of Friends of 10 Mile Creek and Little Seneca Reservoir in support of a stronger forest conservation law. Friends of 10 Mile Creek is a member of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition and contributed to the coalition recommendations. I also personally served on the county's climate work group on adaptation and sequestration. A bit of background, the coalition initiated an effort to strengthen the county's forest conservation law in summer 2020. And in response to our advocacy, the planning department also developed this no net loss of forest initiative in November 21, which led to the proposed amendments you have before you today. The amendments proposed by the planning department staff represent a significant improvement over the current law, and we very much appreciate their efforts. But they do still fall short of the recommendations of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition, and it is not clear that no net loss of forest would be fully achieved in particular projects. And we have specifically asked the Planning Board to recommend legislation to the council that is consistent with the recommendations of the Forest Coalition. I won't go through all of them. You have heard most of these from Eric and Marissa. I will just add a few highlights that were suggested by members of our board that were not fully discussed, which is that, the replacement ratio be based not simply on the number of trees lost, but on the measurements at diameter at breast height of the trees removed. So, for example, the loss of 1 tree with a 24-inch DBH would have to be replaced by 16 trees with a 3-inch DBH. They also asked that you consider assisted natural regeneration of forests as an alternative to planting, if this is found to be practical. And by assisted natural regeneration, I'm referring to practices such as removal of invasive species and protection from deer. We know it's not always practical. More details are in our written testimony. In the remainder of my time, I want to call your attention to the particular importance of forests in Upper Montgomery County, because they are sources of the water we drink and are also hot spots of deforestation. In other words, location of deforestation matters. While forests in the 10 Mile Creek watershed, for example, are designated for protection under the 2014 amended master plan, neighboring watersheds, which also drain to the Little Seneca Reservoir, our drought backup drinking water supply, are hotspots of deforestation. The Clarksburg subwatershed was found to have had the single highest deforestation rate in the county in data covering the period of 2009 to 2014 when the study was done. It was near 7%, which is twice as high as all but one other subwatershed in the up county. And if I could show a slide that I sent in. Okay, I don't see it.
Looks
There it
like
is.
it's coming up.
Next, okay, the next one. Okay, so the impacts of forest loss become most visible during heavy rainstorms when tributary streams load more sediment and nutrient pollution into this emergency backup reservoir, as you see on this slide. The image was posted by Montgomery Parks immediately following the July 2019 rain bomb. And I also call your attention to a 2015 study that found the rate of sediment accumulation in Little Seneca is almost twice as high as comparable drinking water reservoirs in Maryland. Our forests provide a foundation for climate resilience. They're the first line of defense against extremes in both temperatures and rainfall associated with climate change. In addition to reducing the urban heat island effect and mitigating floods, they're the first line of defense for protecting the quality of the water we drink because they reduce this runoff of sediment and other pollutants, which increase the cost of water treatment. It can't be said enough times that drainage from all up county watersheds enters the Potomac River nearby and upstream from our drinking water intake. Therefore, our forests are also the first line of defense for critical lifeline water infrastructure systems and should be classified as critical natural infrastructure. In other words, they're the lifeline of our lifeline critical infrastructure and merit even higher priority and a greater level of protection than infrastructure that is merely critical. Lastly, they provide many well-known benefits, which I will not repeat. I will add, for Thrive 2050 to be successful in driving transit-oriented development, it is imperative that we also change the development trajectory away from the sprawl development patterns we continue to see in our up county, maintain our existing forests, and that the planning board take location and forest benefits into account in their development decisions. In closing, we ask you again to please strengthen the bill you recommend to the council, consistent with the recommendations of the coalition. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Denise Gutera.
Good afternoon, Planning Board. I am Denise Guitarra, Maryland Conservation Advocate, testifying on behalf of Audubon Naturalist Society. For 125 years, ANS has inspired people to enjoy, learn about, and protect nature. We thank the Planning Board for the opportunity to provide testimony on item number 6, Montgomery County Forest Conservation Law, in today's public hearing. More details can be found in my written testimony. In 2020, ANS and our local and state environmental partners formed the Montgomery County Forest Coalition. The 12-member coalition's goals are for the county to 1, reach a no net loss of forest, and 2, a net gain of forest by prioritizing the protection of forest ecosystems. The coalition has been meeting regularly with council members, planning staff to learn more and discuss the ways that we can update together the county's forest conservation law. We have been active participants in the planning department's no net loss initiative. Planning staff's forest conservation recommendations presented today make some improvements to the existing county's forest conservation law, but their recommendations are not ambitious enough to truly get the county to a no net loss and a net gain of forests. 2 areas where the planning staff recommendations could be improved are: forest ecosystems need to be prioritized and not listed just as an alternative, and replanting ratios need to be higher. Montgomery County's Forest Coalition is proposing higher replanting ratios, as seen in my written testimony and those that have testified already. There are 2 planning staff recommendations we support, which are to focus reforestation and afforestation requirements in equity-focused areas and to increase tree maintenance requirements. ANS, as part of the MoCo Forest Coalition, is recommending the Planning Board to pass and approve the strongest possible protections for our forests by taking into consideration the following 6 main recommendations. protect existing forest ecosystems, tighten requirements around forest conservation easements, strengthening replanting ratios to ensure no net loss of forest, strengthening replanting requirements to require replanting of forest ecosystems and not just trees, strengthening watershed replantings, and require forest stand delineation prior to submitting any application plan for development of a site. On behalf of ANS and our 28,000 members and supporters, we urge the Planning Board to consider the Montgomery County Forest Coalition's recommendations and to pass the strongest possible forest amendments. Remember, the best time to plant a tree in a forest was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Carolyn Taylor.
Having trouble with the camera. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're cutting out a little bit, but we can hear you, but we don't see you.
Okay. I'm in the broadband deficit area. I apologize for the camera not working. It was earlier.
That's okay. You might want to just not even bother to try to turn on the camera. It might help you with your bandwidth so we can make sure we hear you.
Yeah. Well played. All right. For the record, Caroline Taylor. I'm here on behalf of Montgomery Countryside Alliance, our members and our board. I am also representing MCA as part of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition, and my job has been made easier by the good testimony of my colleagues previously. I do want to note that for some, the idea of a no net loss of forest is a nice idea. It's more than a nice idea. It's part of a systems approach to our future survival, and that is not an overstatement. I concur with our colleagues who have praised staff there at Planning on their work on creating very good suggestions to move forward towards no net loss. But we do ask that the Planning Board look carefully at the complementary and enhanced recommendations from the Forest Coalition. So you have my written testimony. I am going to dive briefly into a couple of points of conversation that occurred previously with staff and Planning Board members. I was a little concerned to hear, although I do understand board members' question about quality of forest and whether we, look at that in terms of whether there needs to be some of things are treated less importance if they have invasives, et cetera, in them. I will say that even though we are plagued, a number of our forests throughout the county are plagued with invasives and declining trees, the notion that we would dismiss them as having ecological function and therefore needed to be mitigated at their loss is troubling, and I hope that we do not go down that avenue. Any forest here is filtering and cleaning our source water. It's controlling stormwater. It's stabilizing soil. We need to improve these forests, but I don't want to dismiss those that are standing. There was also an important conversation regarding parks noting the difficulty and sometimes impossibility of establishing forests along riparian borders, stream corridors, especially with the way we're getting our precipitation now, both volume and velocity. It should be a primary consideration to try to reforest those areas, but just let me give you a practical example of what we've experienced with the relief program, which is part of, in partnership with planning. So relief aims to plant along stream riparian corridors, and we've had significant success, but I will give you two examples of where I believe Board Member Rubin's call for less prescriptive opportunities, more creative opportunities for establishing environmental benefit in those areas. One was our pilot planting along a section of the Monocacy River. And we had, I think it was referred to a rain bomb some minutes ago back in 2019, where our newly planted area along the Monocacy bank there was under probably no less than 4 feet of fast moving water. The good news is, as a result of the requirements of planting, the size of the trees planted, et cetera, that we only lost 2 trees having been washed away down the river. We did sustain a fair amount of debris damage on branches and so forth, but the trees survived. So that was one instance in which we believe, and the trees are still surviving and thriving now, that worked. And that's one. However, we had another property that by all accounts was somewhat up away from a branch called Horsepen Branch near Poolsville. And what we discovered through several seasons is that it is underwater a number of months of the year. And therefore planting in certain areas of the acreage under easement has been almost impossible, and trees have had to be moved outside of the areas. So I give you these practical examples to say that there's not a cookie cutter approach to say that we should offer carte blanche alternatives to planting along stream corridors, riparian buffers. But I believe that there needs to be an analysis or an evaluation of the conditions at site to understand how best to treat them. And so I look forward to that modification in language, and I look forward to being able to work on those plantings in a more creative way in the future. So with that, with our colleagues, we are keenly interested in advancing the strongest possible amendments so that we achieve not only no net loss, but an expansion of the important and ever functioning forest in Montgomery County. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Sheldon Fishman.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Anderson and members of the Planning Board. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're a little backlit, but we see you and hear you.
Okay. My name is Sheldon Fishman. My family has lived in Montgomery County since 1973. For my wife, it was a return to Montgomery County, where she graduated from Pleasant View Elementary School in Kensington and Wheaton High School. We are very grateful for the services from your Parks Department and many other county agencies. Tip O'Neill said, "All politics is local." We live 2 blocks from Georgia Avenue, and from my backyard, I can see the Beltway. Well, this is a congested area. As you can see, maybe not, the forest in Sligo Creek Park touches our backyard. And if you could put up the second page of my testimony, I would appreciate it.
We'll see what we can do, yeah.
Okay. Today, I'm representing Friends of Sligo Creek, a nonprofit dedicated to preserving and improving Sligo Creek Park. Members along the full length of Sligo Creek have partnered with the Parks Department, for example, the Weed Warriors program, to help them maintain the health of this forest. Friends of Sligo Creek request improvements to your draft forest conservation law and regulations. The specific requests are in my written testimony, and you've already heard most of them earlier because, and they are also in the testimony submitted by Friends of Sligo Creek by Kit Gage. That testimony is consistent and supportive of the recommendations of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition. And in respect for your time, since you've already heard most of those specific recommendations, I will stop here and thank you.
Thank you. I believe next we have Naomi Bolanos.
Good afternoon, Planning Board members. I want to first thank you for your time today and the opportunity to speak on agenda item number 6. My name is Naomi Bolaños, and I'm a resident of Germantown and a high school student at Clarksburg High School in Clarksburg, Maryland. I'm also an organizer and advisory board member of Student Advocates Protecting the Planet. Saplings is a youth environmental forum project created by high school students for high school students to learn about environmental issues and grow into the environmental stewards of tomorrow. I'm here today on the behalf of all youth to urge you to recommend the strongest possible protection of our forests through updating the Forest Conservation Law based on recommendations from the Montgomery County Forest Coalition as outlined in my written testimony. For the past 10 years, I have watched acres of familiar forest communities be lost to development. In 2011, when I immigrated here to the United States with my family, I didn't know how to speak English, and it was difficult to find a community of people that understood me. But one place where I always felt heard was the forest. Locals' forest ecosystems provided me with a sense of familiarity because I saw my home country of Costa Rica in these forests, and I saw my family in these forests. These forest ecosystems are now disappearing and not being sufficiently replaced, and I see my future disappearing along with them without both a larger net gain of forest ecosystems to achieve a no net loss of forests. By 2050, I will only be 45 years old. My generation is already living with the impacts of climate change, and we will have to continue living with them. So if Montgomery County wants to ensure that a healthy and habitable community is still possible by 2050, then we must protect forests to preserve our watersheds, the water we drink, my community, and the future of all youth. So I ask you to please strengthen the bill to update the forest conservation law based on recommendations from the MoCo Forest Coalition, because forests are essential in ensuring that a world of tomorrow is possible in Montgomery County and the world at large. Replenishing the forests, restoring the haven of nature, and redressing the ravaged landscape cannot wait. Thank you.
Thank you. Allison Sweeney. I think you're muted. We see you, and or maybe it's your volume. I don't know. We can't. I see. Oh, there. It seems like you're cutting out because the blue box around you flashed, which indicated that you're coming through on audio. But yeah, I see you're hitting the mute and unmute button, but I'm not hearing you. Hold on one second. Let me see if it's at this end. Oh, maybe you need to unplug your headphones?
I just did.
Oh, there we go. Now we can hear you. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, perfect.
Much better.
Good afternoon, Chairman Anderson and members of the Planning Board. My name is Allison Sweeney, and I'm a current sophomore at Poolsville High School and a lifelong resident of Montgomery County. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony today, and I'm a representative of Montgomery County Saplings, a coalition engaging students in climate justice and forest conservation efforts. It's trite, but it's true. For change to be sustainable, it must be incremental. In this instance, the damaging implications of deforestation have been bubbling over for far too long, and it demands our attention and due diligence in developing innovative solutions to climate change as a whole and to climate justice issues. I commend the Planning Board's attentiveness to this issue and engaging the community's voices around avenues to no net forest loss. A hallmark of the Montgomery County Climate Action Plan is to protect public health from climate-driven impact, which revolves around the preservation of the area and quality of our natural resources. With the added dimension of racial justice, targeting areas such as Clarksburg will have a more debilitating impact on the surrounding areas and BIPOC communities that are disproportionately affected by deforestation and renovation projects that are going on their land. I concur with the contentions of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition, spoken in the need to strengthen the provisions to urban planning and further the climate action plans. Forests are the sources of our healthiest streams and rivers in the region, and they filter pollutants such as pesticides, fertilizers, and street runoff, making it essential as a natural resource to filter our resources, and reducing flooding and forest loss could result in increased property damage to homes and businesses, and again, disproportionately BIPOC communities and low-income communities. Preventing forest loss is cost-effective and much less expensive than mitigating pollutions and cleaning our waterways. As spoken before, it was the best idea to plant more trees 20 years ago as of now, as we are now doing damage control to find more regenerative solutions and more preventative solutions to further damage. Every 10% increase in forest cover in a watershed produces double the savings in water treatment downstream, according to research supported by American Forests. Protecting and preserving our forests makes a robust case for good financial sense, and makes it a feasible plan that will protect our forests and also be cost effective as a proven and affordable and common sense solution to protect public health in accordance with the MOGO climate plan. We have to defend our safety and push for the strongest possible forest protections. And again, the 2-to-1 replanting ratio that will ensure that we are protecting and building our forests as a place of mental health support, not just of support, but the proven psychological benefits of being outdoors and having forests, even as community building and community care, as we engage our entire community's voices on this issue. Protecting the clean air and providing the open space can turn into physical, mental, and social well-being that yield numerous benefits to how the community can engage. And according also to the climate plan and the carbon sequestration speaks to the urgency that we must solve our climate crisis as an incremental step, and in this county alone, which has the resources to do so, using the existing natural resources to plan for a climate resilient future. Thank you, and I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you. Craig Carlson.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with yourselves today. To provide a bit of background on myself, my family and I live in the North Woodside neighborhood of Silver Spring. I'm a retired public health professional. Some of that work involved addressing environmental health issues. I'm also a part-time photographer. And the reason I mention that is about 18 months ago, I and a dozen other photographers began assisting area environmental groups to help them better communicate the benefits of their program's efforts for community residents, as well as for our physical environment. Two of the programs that I'm personally working with are our county government's own Rainscapes and Shade Tree programs. As you likely know, these two programs' objectives include helping maintain and expand the tree cover and better manage surface water runoff. Before I begin, I'll acknowledge that some of my remarks don't speak so much to the finer details of the proposal that we're all considering, but instead to the law's higher level objectives. From what I've seen traveling around the county with this volunteer work, I can't help but think that we need to be reaching further and challenging ourselves to do more than what I see detailed in the proposed amendments. And here were some observations for why I say this. First, when considering the planting of new trees, there doesn't appear to be anywhere near enough resources going into this effort relative to where the demand still is. And this includes not enough emphasis on obliging those who receive the trees to adequately water them during the first few years so that they can survive. I'd estimate that about a third or more of the trees that I watched being planted as part of the Shade Tree program are those that are replacing dead saplings that have been planted in the previous year or two, but which died for not being adequately watered. Second, developers, as we go around the area and look at the lands that they're developing where trees are being put in by that Shade Tree program, developers seem to be able to remove large numbers of healthy trees from the land on which they build homes or townhouses, well beyond what's needed for the actual construction of those. After construction, the developers turn the open space into grasslands and plant just a few trees in all that cleared space. This ends up obliging the new owners to water and maintain those grass lawns. It seems like it would make a lot more sense and be more cost effective and environmentally sound to oblige those developers to leave more of the original healthy trees in place. A second best objective or option might be to require them to plant a much greater number of trees of varied local species and ensure those tree saplings get adequate care for their first critical years to ensure they can survive. In our own neighborhood here in Silver Spring, we've watched the developer who's putting up the new Woodland Elementary School cut down large numbers of very healthy tall trees from that school's property. It's very hard to imagine that such extensive clearing of trees is really needed to construct that new building. So why in 2022, with all that we now know about the importance of forests and tree cover, are developers able to carry on in this way? Third and last, I'd like to suggest that the new bill's wording pertaining to stream and stream valley buffers be expanded to better detail the protections that are needed across the breadth of watersheds, from large and substantial rivers and streams down to the smaller creeks. I'd like to suggest that these areas should be prioritized for tree planting efforts, as these are an especially cost-effective point of intervention for helping reduce surface erosion, stream silting, and all the environmental degradation that results from this. Thanks for your time and your consideration.
Thank you. Shruti Bhagnagar.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you and see you.
Thank you, Chairman Anderson. And it's a hard path to follow the students' incredible testimony, but I will try. Good afternoon. My name is Shruti Bhatnagar, and I'm chair of the Montgomery County Sierra Club Group. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify today. Protecting forests is one of the most fundamental, straightforward, and important actions that we can take to address climate change and ensure a healthy, safe, and clean future for the residents of Montgomery County. We thank the Montgomery County Planning Board for their effort on their proposed forest conservation law and suggest some recommendations to strengthen it. It is the Sierra Club Montgomery County's priority as an organization and as a member of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition to reach no net loss and a net gain of forests by prioritizing the protection of forest ecosystems. You've heard from some other representatives of the coalition today, and I'm briefly reiterating the following 6 amendments to the law. Protect existing forest ecosystems as a #1 priority. Require forest stand delineation to be evaluated and submitted to the planning board prior to submitting any application plan for development of a site. Strengthen replanting ratios to 2:1 in all scenarios. Strengthen replanting requirements to require the planting of forest ecosystems, not just trees. Strengthen watershed considerations so that forest ecosystem replanting improves the water quality of our communities in specific watersheds and incentives replanting within Montgomery County, not outside of our county. Tighten requirements around forest conservation easements so they cannot be easily extinguished or relocated. The Sierra Club, as part of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition, asks you to please take into consideration these amendments and include them in the law that is being evaluated. These additional recommendations will strengthen the forest conservation law and help in addressing the climate change issue. Thank you so much for your time today, and I really appreciate your due consideration.
Thank you. So that concludes our remote testifiers. So we will call up the folks who are here in person. That would be Amanda Farber and Matt Wessel. Ms. Farber, you're first on the list, but you could do whatever you guys can work out.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Amanda Farber. Happy to be here in person. I was told there would be cake, and there was, so I'd like to start with a little throwback Thursday. It is exactly 5 years ago this month when I testified before this board to keep the 2 street trees outside of Silver Diner in Bethesda that were literally on the chopping block due to conflict between development, sidewalk space, and outdoor dining. So some in this room may remember that dilemma. Thanks to the decision of this board, I'm happy to report that those trees now have 5 years of growth and are looking lovely. So just wanted to share that. But today, I'm here to ask the board to help decide the fate of many more trees, whole forest ecosystems, in fact. As a member of Conservation Montgomery, I've had the privilege to be part of the Montgomery County Forest Coalition and also to attend the No Net Loss of Forest work sessions held by the outstanding planning staff. I'm here to urge the board to transmit to the council the strongest possible amendments to the forest conservation law as recommended by the Forest Coalition, as well as some changes proposed by planning staff. You have our written testimony, so I'd like to speak in support of 2 proposals in particular as they hit close to home. The first is the planning staff recommendation to eliminate certain exemptions for activity on certain defined tracts in CR zones. It just so happens that 8 out of the 9 major projects currently under construction in Bethesda right now, in downtown Bethesda, qualified for this exemption. But some other recent downtown Bethesda projects did not, and they did have to provide mitigation, proving it is doable. And even under the staff proposal, each qualifying CR project may only be required to provide a relatively small amount of mitigation, but that's okay. The point is, it all adds up. Projects in this category would still be able to pick from a menu of mitigation options, allowing flexibility and reducing any burden. Second, nearly everyone agrees that watershed locations must receive more of a consideration when it comes to forest mitigation. Montgomery County is over 500 square miles and home to 8 major watersheds. As it stands now, too often mitigation occurs far away from where trees are removed, sometimes creating a game of musical mitigation. We feel strongly that there should be greater incentives for planting locally within the same watershed and greater requirements if projects opt to mitigate further away. Lastly, I know it has come up in board discussions, so I'd also like to take this opportunity to remind everyone that there are 3 major tree laws and forest laws which are in place in Montgomery County. The tree canopy law, the roadside tree protection law, and what we're talking about today, the forest conservation law. We recently developed a County and Tree Forest Law 101 document outlining these 3 main laws, which you should have gotten with the testimony. And I just want to emphasize that all of these laws need strengthening. Lastly, I will expand on what Denise had said. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. The same can be said for our forest and tree laws. The best time to further strengthen our forest conservation law was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. And I hope that's what you will help do today. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Wessel.
Good afternoon. Am I the last speaker? All right. Well, thank you and good afternoon. For the record, my name is Matt Wessel, and I chair the Environmental Committee for the Maryland Building Industry Association. I'm also a landscape architect with 20 years of experience in the industry and have a lot of experience implementing the Forest Conservation Act, particularly here in Montgomery County. There are a lot of changes being proposed to the overall structure and individual components of the law. Probably much more than I can get to in detail during the time allotted for testimony. But I just want to hit on some high-level points that we've covered in a pretty comprehensive letter that we submitted to the board that I hope you all have had a chance to take a look at. But I kind of want to, we do a lot of work in Montgomery County, and I want to kind of set the stage for what the future of development in Montgomery County looks like and why it's not necessarily comparable to other jurisdictions. The future of Montgomery County is increasingly urban, infill, and redevelopment. Adjusting thresholds and planting ratio impacts for these types of projects, it affects them differently than the greenfield projects on agricultural and forested sites that are more plentiful in other adjacent counties, because Montgomery County experienced a lot more development before the law was created in 1992. So it's not an apples-to-apples comparison on how development is impacted in the different counties. Getting back to the letter, the overall intent of the letter is to show that the county is already no net loss based on park and planning data from the last decade, and just a handful of recent projects not yet counted in the data, which I can get into in more detail if you would like. But this is also supported by the analysis provided in the staff report for the 15 projects studied that show under current regulations 223% more mitigation was provided than forest removed for those total 15 projects. And that really just shows you how much redevelopment in particular is a catalyst for actually creating more forest in the county, which wouldn't happen if those sites weren't developed. The other purpose of the letter was really to educate how the proposed changes will impact different projects based on experience implementing the law, with several scenarios discussed and solutions offered. One thing all the changes have in common is that they will make development and redevelopment in particular more difficult to implement, and instead of producing no net loss forest, which has already been achieved, will result in a net loss of housing affordability, and ironically create an additional barrier to development projects on smaller urban sites such as biohealth facilities just after a ZTA was passed to expedite their review and approval. Examples provided in the letter show in lieu fee increasing by $500,000 to $800,000 for one redevelopment project, and highlight that the law proposes that 20% of small urban redevelopment projects less than 2 acres be planted with around a 0.4 acre patch of forest in a low priority area instead of being redeveloped. Also discussed are the challenges associated with mitigation banking and in lieu fee in the county, where the preservation of existing forest is no longer allowed due to a recent change in state law that not only doubled the cost of providing mitigation in the county from $26,000 to about $46,000 per acre, but also, as of it stands right now, only 10 acres of mitigation are available for purchase in the county at this moment. Overall, it's a mistake to try to change the forest conservation law into a preservation law. The conservation law was set up to balance development with forest by prioritizing what to save and where to plant based on qualitative factors. Preservation law makes forest save a priority regardless of quality. I really appreciate being involved in the stakeholder working groups at the end of 2021. I think a lot of good ideas were discussed, and unfortunately, I feel like the whole process is being rushed, and some of the things that were discussed aren't really having enough time to be studied to see if we can do things. Like, instead of tweaking thresholds and planning ratios, we should be looking at ways to provide credit for quality improvements that do not unnecessarily take up land, and realize that other county policies such as afforesting unforested streams provide more certain environmental benefits as we work to balance the conservation and quality forest with housing and development. I appreciate you hearing my testimony, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Does anybody on the board want to direct any questions to the folks who are here who have testified? If not, I have some other questions for staff. But
I actually have a question for staff from based on something that that Mr. Oisel just said. What's the process moving forward on the project going through on this legislation going through council? What's our timing? And what's the essentially how's it going to happen?
So if the board approves the draft amendments as they are today or in any form, we'll make adjustments as needed, and then they'll be transmitted to the county council for introduction. The regulations need to be posted in the county register for 30 days, and then the county council can introduce both jointly. And once they do that, there'll be an introduction at the Transportation and Environment Committee. And then there will be a process of a public hearing, a work group, and a final vote. And the timeline that we've heard from council staff is that all of that would conclude around the late fall of 2022.
So is there a time, what's our outside date of getting our comments to council? That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Because this year is an unusual year with an election, we need to submit legislation sort of ASAP if it is going to actually be heard by this council. So we have been told by council staff we need to submit any potential ZTA essentially within the next week or so.
Is there a ZTA for this? I thought this was basically.
I'm sorry. The changes to Chapter 22A.
Okay, I wasn't aware that there were restrictions on an election year for legislation. I thought it was just on zoning.
I think it's more of a practical consideration than a legal one about land use. It's about the fact they're just not doing much once they get to the middle of this year. Now, I just want to return to this question of are we not losing forest? There's a specific factual claim that's made in a bunch of what I take it as some form email that was prepared by one or more of the advocates or advocacy groups. Between 2010 and 2017, the county lost more than 1,000 acres of forest, the fourth highest amount of forest cleared among all counties in Maryland. Is that true? I mean, or what does that mean?
I don't know what data was used to create those numbers, but I mean, again, we can only provide information based on the amount of forest that was cleared through projects subject to the county's forest conservation law. So that number and that time period is close. Our numbers are less in terms of forest cleared during that time period. But my guess is that whatever data that is considers clearing of forest in the county as a whole, and not only, the projects and the forest cleared to meet requirements of the forest conservation law.
Okay, and then based on your calculation, is not the same time period, which is confusing.
Right, it's
But your
similar,
calculation is 2011 to 2021. Project subject to forest conservation law, 805 acres cleared, 693 planted. So I infer from what you just said that you're saying, well, 805 and 1,000 are kind of in the ballpark, but that's sort of implies, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, that that number of 1,000 acres cleared doesn't account for any offsetting planting.
Right, I would agree with that, probably.
Okay, so here's where I'm coming from. It's not clear to me, factually speaking, that we are losing more forest than we're gaining right now. I just think there's no, I'm not satisfied there's any evidence of that. It may be that we're gaining forest, maybe we're losing forest. Sounds like it's probably pretty close to no net loss right now, at least on a countywide basis. For that reason, I'm hesitant to support dramatic changes to the forest conservation law or to the other related laws and rules. So I think most of what staff has proposed is relatively modest, but I think appropriate to the nature of the problem as it's been demonstrated, which is there is some ambiguity and there are some sites that may lose more forest than the mitigation requirements would cause to be replanted, or that there may be some shortfall, but it doesn't sound like it's much, if there's any at all. And so for that reason, I would say, my point of view is the staff has gone far enough, with a few exceptions. Specifically, I would not support increasing any afforestation requirements for the high density or mixed use zones. Particularly if we're talking about no net loss, I'm not sure why projects, I mean, the reference was made to these sites are getting a lot of density, which implies that the theory of this is you should have to plant more trees because you're building a bigger project. I'm not sure what that has to do with how many trees there are or are not on the site. I thought our forest laws were generally predicated on the idea you try to mitigate for the impact you cause, not how much money you made or how many units what your yield was. I thought that was, I'm not really prepared to embrace this idea that because you built a big project, you should have to plant a lot of trees. There should be a pretty close nexus to the extent possible between the amount of mitigation of forest you have to do and the impact you are having on forest. So that's basically my first proposition for the rest of the board. Secondly, I would propose allowing credit for forest banks for afforestation in these zones, and or credit for trees that are planted on site that don't meet the definition of forest. I've said a number of times, I understand the difference between forests and trees in terms of their ecological function, but we're not going to get planting on site or even in the same watershed in most of the intensively developed areas of the county. And I agree with Ms. Farber that we need more trees in downtown Bethesda and in downtown Silver Spring. In these places, we're not going to get forests in most of those places beyond the forests such as they exist, particularly in stream valley parks like Rock Creek, Sligo Creek, and a few small patches of forest that are on private land that are close in and in the intensively developed areas. So I would propose that afforestation requirements for those zones should be eligible for credit based on a calculation of, canopy at maturity or something. I try to kind of come up with some rough area equivalents for if you plant trees, whether it's in the right-of-way or on the site itself, you should get credit for that, because I think that those serve important environmental benefits as well, and we really do need to focus on street trees and trees that are on the site, even the ones that don't qualify as forests. Also, I know park staff has told me this, and I've heard from other people who are study trees for a living, that in many, and I think BIA alluded to this a little bit, and I think even some of the people who are testifying in favor of stronger protections, that small or fragmented forests are not necessarily helpful, or it's difficult to get them to thrive. And that's another reason why I think we ought to be not insisting on eking out every tiny increment of forest that could be saved or replanted, particularly in these intensely developed watersheds, but why we ought to be focused on more trees, not necessarily forests. And it seems to me that would be a path forward to tying trees into this discussion, not necessarily forests as such. Thirdly, and this is what I want to return to, I'd like to clarify that on-site planning is not feasible where it's inconsistent with the urban design principles that are relevant to the project. I think especially about Montgomery County, Germantown, where the plan that we approved, it's been several years ago now, it's been probably almost probably 9 or 10 years ago, but that site saved a lot of trees, but the project does not, as a result, the project doesn't address the street, the major thoroughfare. And I think that's a big problem. The idea that the trees must be saved no matter what, even at the expense of the function of the site for its intended use, is not only suboptimal from the point of view of site design and the abstract, or the idea that it's not, doesn't appear optimal or function in terms of, access for people and vehicles and transit and all the rest of that stuff, but environmentally it can be, it can compromise the site as well. For example, in Montgomery County, Germantown, I think leaving the forest between the college's proposed development program and the backside of the site, which could provide access to 355, is going to make it very hard to have transit service serve the college. And so I think we ought to incorporate some recognition of the fact that our environmental reviewers should not be insisting on saving trees that are in a way that's on the site, in a way that's inconsistent with achieving the other planning goals that are applicable to the project. And I'll just leave it there. That's my perspective, but you guys can.
Chair Anderson, can I
Yeah.
just address the last one? Because this provision is currently in the law about the not possible minimum retention clause, and it does allow for, in certain zones, an optional method. It allows for when it is not possible due to, types of issues like you are saying, that you don't have to meet it on site, because otherwise it would be required to be met completely on site. Essentially,
Right. What I'm suggesting, though, is that we need to sharpen that, because I've seen projects that basically where the staff came in and said, look what a great job we did saving the trees, and I looked at the site and said, that just doesn't seem optimal to me. I understand there is, I just think the language as it was presented seems to set a pretty high bar, like that it's impossible. And I just think we ought to be a little more clear that we're talking about what is possible, not just in light of, does it violate the laws of physics, as opposed to is it possible, consistent with the other planning objectives that are relevant in the master plan, urban design guidelines. And in some cases, like in the CR zones, we have all these requirements about building form and placement that are designed to achieve these specific objectives. And I think that they need to be prioritized, even, yes, sometimes at the expense of having to cut down trees on the site, because otherwise we have buildings that are set way back from the street behind a forest in a pretty urban location, as it was with that Montgomery College project. And I think there have been a couple others, but that's the one that have sort of stuck with me over time because it seemed pretty glaring.
Sure. That might be a policy thing, because the way that the law is written, it just says that the planning board or planning director, as appropriate, finds that forest retention required in the subsection is not possible. So it's up to the planning board or the planning director.
Yeah, I think the problem is that word possible.
But
Possible is, I mean, saying it's not possible is a very, like I say, that implies it cannot be physically done.
Sure.
Possible, more like feasible, consistent with other objectives identified in the zoning code, the relevant master plan, and any design guidelines that are applicable. Seems more to be a little bit better at guiding. So we don't, and you know, when we get a project, we could say no, go back and do it again, but then you've just created a huge problem for, nobody wants you to go send them back to, especially when the applicant has agreed with the staff, whether reluctantly or not, to design their whole project around avoiding some trees, and then the planning board is not going to say, no, go back and start over again. So I'm trying to give some direction here, since we're on the subject, so we don't have this situation where people are so intent on trying to save every tree that they compromise other important public interest objectives as a result.
Okay, we can certainly look at it. Obviously, if we have to make sure that it's not contrary to the state law if we were to change that provision.
So I want to touch on two things. One, I see a strong distinction, as I was explaining earlier, between afforestation and reforestation. Okay, and I do believe that they could be treated differently. The reforestation, I know that the state law changed, which made it very difficult to bank by retaining existing forest. And I heard the testimony where the preference is to afforest, you know, to create new forest, as if you're removing forest, as opposed to simply retaining existing forest. You know, we always got the applicant always got more credit anyway if you would afforest. It was, you know, it was a much smaller credit if you retained existing forest. But I still would like to see if there's anything that we could do in county law that would not be inconsistent by finding ways to retain existing forest as much as possible, in terms of if the owners of that land want to do something and figure out a way to, you know, to make some, you know, to return some revenue, but, you know, kind of creating our own internal system of banking that would allow, and I don't know how to do that. I mean, I'm just trying to figure out if there's a creative solution that we could find to retain as much existing forest as possible, because it's always better to retain. I know that it's great to create forest, but the creation of a new forest takes many, many years, whereas retention of existing forest, it's already there and established, and it can be added to, it can be enriched, and there are ways of doing that. So given that, one, I would like to see if there is a way that we could, without going against state law, but clearly finding ways to encourage programs that would create retention of existing forest, and that could protect against a number of things. Maybe, you know, you're talking about areas where usually there's some, we want to reduce the development potential because it's farther out, and we want to stop the sprawl. That's where we want to really protect the existing forests, so that it leaves or allows for more development in the developable areas, the down county areas that are, you know, more, you know, closer in. We can create those, you know, 15-minute communities. They're more urban. And so that gets me to, I saw, did you want to respond to that?
I do, actually. I want to respond to that because
Okay.
we have given that a lot of thought. As you know, with the way that the state legislation went down. And I hope that everybody is listening to this, because we really hope that we can still change that state law to allow for the preservation of existing forests through mitigation banks. It's something that's very important. However, we have been thinking of potential other ways. It's a little bit more difficult. It takes more staff time, which is one of the reasons why Kristen put in her slide that, we might ask for more staff in order to do some of these things. But one way, potentially, the law does allow you to retain existing forest if it's done for a specific project. It can be off-site retention for a specific project, but it cannot be put under an easement before you have that project come through. So it's not a mitigation bank, but it's essentially, staff can essentially be like a matchmaker between knowing, certain property owners that have forests that would like to retain it and a developer that has a need. And that is something that we are interested in exploring.
Well, then I think we should, in our response or transmittal comment to the council, I think we need to dedicate a part of that comment to this proposed idea of doing this, because I think it's a big deal. I think we want to retain, because no net loss is retention. That's a big part of the retention. And so I think, especially in the areas that have very good quality, older established forest. So I'd like to see something in the transmittal that addresses that, and that what we are proposing we would like to do, and why we need staff to do it. Second, I'm sorry.
I just want, on this point, that was kind of what I was getting at when I said for afforestation, you ought to be either able to claim credit for trees on the site that aren't forest, and or claim credit in a bank for something that's already planted. Now, in light of that AG's opinion and the state law change, we can't do that do the existing forest retention for sites that weren't planted anew to create the bank. But we could do that, I think, for anything that we're requiring that goes beyond what state law's minimum floor is. So I think that's consistent with what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes, and another possibility is suggesting a fund for the council to fund something where the county, we buy ag easements. We buy agricultural easements to protect land for agriculture in order to provide the farmers for some revenues in order to prevent or to offset their development need in order to accommodate their fiscal needs. Is there a possibility of creating, an easement program for forests in the same way? That's another possibility. It's not within our wheelhouse, but certainly it's something that the county should consider if they're serious about, it goes with the climate action plan, and it's something that the county can take on. So that's a whole nother idea. So getting back to the issue of the difference, so I think in afforestation, I agree with where the chair was going, where I said earlier there could be a difference in afforestation if you have an afforestation requirement. And by the way, I agree that we should strengthen the ratios or the thresholds and the reforestation requirements for properties that are outside in the more suburban and rural areas. In the urban areas, which is mostly afforestation, I do believe that we should be more creative in how we provide credits. I agree that we should look at opportunities for planting trees in areas that need them for shade. We've talked a lot about heat island effect in our urban areas. We should be putting trees everywhere that we can. They don't necessarily have to be part of a forest, because it's very difficult to do that in an urbanized area, to create a forest that's not there. But I think it's almost a marriage between our tree program, some of these programs, and keeping them so separate in silos, I don't think benefits anyone. I think that they should be looked at kind of together and looking at the issue, because the fundamental issue is trees, canopy. It's also forest, but that's, we don't want to lose the trees for the forest, is what I'm trying to say. So I think we should look at creative ways to allow applicants to afforest in a way that becomes more beneficial as an overall environmental impact, not just forest, but other environmental impacts. And, because we do have a problem. Our job is to balance the interests of the county. And we, I take to heart, I don't want to lose the ability to provide affordable housing because the developers can't afford to provide affordable housing because of I'm not saying that we don't want to increase the trees or the forest, but I think we have to do it in an economical way, and that perhaps would do it. We can select the priority areas. I know you indicated in your proposal, which I do like, it also deals with the equity focus areas, that they get landscape credit in the equity focus areas. Well, the question is, why wouldn't they get the same kind of landscape credit in a priority area that is not necessarily suitable for forest, but could certainly accept a smaller stand of trees that could provide environmental benefit. And then I just want to reiterate what I said about the earlier about the planting in the stream valleys. And I think that those need to be looked at in a case-by-case basis, very site-specific. And I would clearly recommend that we don't make it prescriptive, but we provide the ability of our environmental technicians, both on the planning staff and even in consultation with the park staff, to understand what the best environmental solution would be at a particular time for a site. I'm sure that's what we do as part of our plans, as part of our forest conservation plans. But I'd like to see that, really be understood. I'd like to see the comment that what our goal is yes, it's no net loss, but we have an overall goal of environmental sustainability, and we need to find the best ways to do it. And if it means figuring out a way to take those baby steps and first establishing the ecosystem that would support a forest at a later date, then that's what we want to do, something that could prevent the flooding if that is what is carrying the debris into the streams. But I think we need to look at it from a much more fundamental approach in that regard. Finally, I would really like the board to take up as a priority at next legislative session with the state is to get back to, not only get back to the banking, which we talked about, but also to look at other ways. We have a much more robust reforestation requirement than the state does. I mean, our reforestation requirement is much more stringent. And we always are up against the State Highway Administration whenever there's a project that they go to DNR and they say, we're not subject to your forest conservation requirements. And we lose, and I think that's where we really lose the opportunity. So I would like, and what we've done in two of them.
If in fact there's net loss trees, it's attributable to state projects, I believe.
Yes. And if that's, and I've seen it in two major projects that we've had, well, three. You've got it on the ICC. We had to fight to get, replacement of what was very old, very, very good forest quality. And, we were able to do that because we used our land as leverage. We're in that same direction with the managed lanes project in our mitigation discussions with the state. They didn't want to give us anything more than their regulatory requirement, which is, not a good thing. And we, again, would use our land as the leverage, but we can't always do that. The Purple Line is a perfect example that you all raised earlier. So I would love to see us and get together, perhaps with the Forest Conservation Coalition, with the county, and push forward with state legislation to shore up the state's requirements for their projects to provide much more robust forest conservation or forest reforestation requirements on state road projects.
Jerry, you muted yourself.
Yeah, I just want to comment. From all that I've heard, obviously I'm more on the transportation side, but I guess what I see created is kind of a tree bank. We all have savings accounts or try to put together, and I think that would be areas that could be added forest, particularly in stream valleys where it's important, but also in urban areas where it's done. But collectively, it represents something that's improving the quality of the air and the environability of the county. So I would look to define it as a tree bank. It's new areas, but it's also urban areas where trees are put, and collectively it does support the quality of the air in the county. That's a brief comment.
Carol, did I understand you correctly that you're in agreement with my proposals? I think they at least roughly track them, but I'm not.
Yeah, I am, and though I would like to see I believe that we could probably, for the green sites, the areas in more of the suburban and the rural areas, I don't have a problem making the thresholds and the reforestation requirements even stricter.
So we need a little
I think on that,
But in the urban areas, I do agree.
on that table,
Let's look on this table.
what I had in mind was,
We lost the table.
you were there, go back.
There we
Okay,
go.
the bottom three are the ones I was talking about.
Yeah, I'm in agreement there. I believe that we should be, though, provide credit. I think it should be clear that the credit, that some of the afforestation credit could be attributed to both some landscape and some other tree replacement in street trees and others, non-forest applications. But in order to do that, I actually would increase the requirements for reforestation in the outer areas.
So I'll just add briefly that one of the most common, well, there are several common ways that afforestation requirements are typically met. It's typically through purchasing bank credits, paying fee in lieu, or landscaping. Landscaping is, and establishing individual landscape trees to get credit is already one of the primary ways that an afforestation requirement can be met. So I think that's very possible, what you're suggesting, because it's definitely already in the law.
Yeah, I think we should make clear that trees or perhaps landscaping, if that's not practical, on the site and the right-of-way abutting the site. So if they're street trees, that should be just like at the Silver Diner, Ms. Farber.
Okay.
Anything else, Barthop? Okay, I think we have.
I want to ask another question about this table. Are we okay with keeping it at the 20%?
No, I'm saying I don't think we should increase the afforestation requirement in those zones.
Okay, so keep that at the 15%.
Yeah.
Because originally Commissioner Rubin had talked about maybe having two
At the
options.
reforestation, not the afforestation.
Okay. We
Yeah,
already
I'm
have the
ta-
two
I'm
options at the
talking about Not
reforestation.
increasing the afforestation requirements in those three zoning categories at the bottom of that table.
So you would be,
Density, mixed use and commercial, where they're currently at 15, they would stay at 15.
Right.
That's what Chair Anderson is proposing.
And the reforestation thresholds would remain the same as what we've proposed.
I would go a little higher on the reforestation.
Can you show us that?
These are not based on zones, so it's across the board.
Right, because I'm thinking in terms of, we're talking about no net loss of forest I look at the reforestation different than the afforestation. So-
Yeah, this is where there are actually trees that are being
Right, and if
removed.
they're taking down trees, they need to replace what they're taking down. So I would look at it at, increasing those ratios. I don't know what the appropriate amount is, but I think they could be increased a little more to make up for what you're losing in some of the afforestation.
we may want to take another look at what that earlier slide that compared the 15 projects and the effects of the reforestation ratios, because I think something to consider is the significance of the increased cost of mitigation for stakeholders in these cases. And you can see specifically, if you look at the amount of forest removed from 7 of those projects was 15.52 acres. What we're proposing, and the reforestation ratios are primarily responsible for this, is at a minimum a 17.58 acre mitigation requirement for those projects. So that's taking into account the reforestation ratio proposal that we just looked at on the other slide.
So you would end up getting actually more than 1-for-1.
Right.
Under what staff currently has proposed as reforestation ratios.
And that's at a minimum.
Then that addresses my
That's
concern.
fine.
And I would say that that's why because the reforestation is actually, it costs more in a lot of ways. That's why we up the afforestation on some of the higher density projects, as we said, because the requirement is quite low compared to what they're getting from. So that's how we were trying to balance this to make it palatable for a developer coming in, so that it wasn't really increasing their costs to a point that it would make them not be able to do the project.
Right, but my concern about doing that is you're balancing the costs on the afforestation, but you're balancing it with the loss in density. And, in other words, I would like to see, obviously, in urban areas, we want to see the density. So I don't want to discourage that from occurring. We have to balance all of these tests. So I think we've got it with the retaining the afforestation at the same level, but not.
Yeah. At least at the same or better.
Yeah, I just want to make sure we're all clear. I want to point out the difference. Like, if you look at this Carter Rock Springs example, because this is what the afforestation difference is. Its current afforestation requiring is 0.19 acres, and the change that we were suggesting just brings it up to 0.25. It's pretty minimal. But obviously, whichever way the board wants to
I just think we're saying
go.
we're not into this idea that
That's fine.
just because it's dense means it should be more.
Right, but I still think if we're also, though, increasing it because we're taking out some of the exceptions. And I think we're in agreement with that.
Right, that's true.
Right, the net effect is to increase planning requirements.
Right, and there may be more afforestation requirements that come out of those projects that would otherwise receive a confirmed FCP exemption because they were in a CR zone.
Right. Okay, I think that wraps it up, and we can adjourn. Thank you all.
Take care. Have a good weekend.
Bye, Jerry.